Hello everyone! So I did mention that I will make a bonus part for the anime style waterfall scene, and I will do just that. So let's get started. Let's go to the view layer here, and go down to the light, and enable these passes here. So let's enable the emission, environment, shadow, ambient occlusion, and the bloom. And basically, what we will do here is we will manipulate all of these passes in the compositor tab. And for that to work, we have to at least render a single image. So by clicking F12 or by going up here in the render and render image. Once you fully render your image, we can now go back to Blender and click the Compositing tab here. You guys might not have these three nodes here, so it's very simple. Let's just click the Use Nodes here. Make sure it is blue. Now, what you will see is you will have a Render Layer node and the Composite node. If you want to use the Viewer node, you can hold Ctrl Shift and left click so that you can see the background of whatever you are working on. We call this background backdrop. To change the zoom or the position of the backdrop, you can click the N key on your keyboard and go here to the View tab. By changing the zoom and the offset, you can change the scale and the position of the backdrop there. Let's go ahead and start. First, let's get a mix color node by holding Shift A and search. We need to remove the bloom from the image. To do that, we can turn this from mix into subtract and connecting the image and the bloom color. And as you can see here, if I hold Ctrl Shift and click on the subtract node, as you can see, we don't have any bloom in our scene. Next, in any anime style, usually they have a blur in the environment. So to do that, we can duplicate the subtract and turn this into mix. Then we can get a blur node. Let's go ahead and connect the image of the subtract to the image on the blur and connect the subtract to the first socket of the mix color. We can then connect the blur to the second socket. Now you might realize that if I change the factor, we don't see any blur. That is because we have not set up our blur yet. So by changing these two values here, we can add bloom into our scene. This X manipulates the blur for the X-axis. This Y manipulates the blur for the Y-axis. Usually I would do 70 by 70. And let's go here. And when we change the factor, we can see there will be a bloom in our scene. Usually I would only go for 0.1 to 0.3. 0.4 is a little too much, as you can see here. And 0.3 is still fine. Now as you can see, we removed the bloom and we added blur into our scene. So the reason why we removed the bloom is because we will add it back to make it look better. So the way to do this is we can duplicate the subtract here, turn this into add, and connect the image to the first socket. Let's duplicate the blur and let's add exposure into our scene. Connect the bloom color to the image, connect them all together, and then you can see here, if I connect this blur to the second image and hold Ctrl Shift click, and when I increase the exposure, you can see that there will be bloom in our scene. And we can also manipulate the blur of the bloom, so we can give it a high number, just like so. We can always change the factor here, so we can also edit the opacity of the bloom. Once you have done that, let's add in another layer of bloom. So we can duplicate these three nodes and just connect them all together. Connect the bloom color to the exposure once again. Now once you did this, you can go ahead and turn these two into 280. And then we can set the factor to 0.2. Now, if you look at this node here, you can see that we have another layer of bloom, which has a lower radius. Next, let's connect the image to the composite node, so that when we render our image, whatever we do here in the compositor tab, it will show in the final render. Let's put this back here. Now, let's add the ambient occlusion, which is this, and let's also add the shadows. So, the way to do it is very simple. It's the same way how we did the bloom. So, we can duplicate this add here, turn this into multiply. We're using multiply this time because we are going to darken some areas and we're not adding some highlights. So let's put that in there, connect it to that. We can also duplicate the blur as well as the color ramp. Then we can connect the shadow to the image, connect the image to the factor, and then the image to the second socket. Now let's look at this node here. If we set the factor to 1, we can see that there is shadows. If I set the blur both to 0, you can see that the shadows will be more sharper. And by increasing the value of these two sockets here, we can blur the shadows the way we want it to be. We can change the color of the shadows by changing the color of the color ramp here in the first slider. So let's change the color to somewhat bluish. Make sure it is not too dark and make sure it is not too light because it is the shadows. Now if we look back here, you can see that there is a massive difference in just using these few nodes here. As you can see there. Now we can go ahead and add the ambient occlusion in our scene. So let's duplicate this multiply here. And duplicate this color ramp. And let's add another blur node. We can connect the ambient occlusion to the image. And let's connect the image to the factor. And then, the same way, just connect this to the second socket of the image texture. Now we have this ambient occlusion in our scene. Again, just like the shadows, we can change the color of the ambient occlusion. We can also blur the ambient occlusion the way we want it, as you can see there, over here. Let's connect this last mix color node to the composite. Then, what we can do next is we can add a color balance. The color balance just manipulates the colors of shadows, midtones, and highlights. Let's change the midtones to slightly yellowish. This makes our rocks slightly yellow. We can also get a hue correct. The hue correct changes the hue based on specific colors. So for example, if we raise up the blue here, we can make the ocean more vibrant. Lastly, we can add a color correction. And basically, what the color correction does is that it is a better version and the combination of color balance and the hue correct. Only difference is you can also change the contrast and the saturation. On the saturation, on the very first slider, we can turn the saturation of everything by raising this number here. So instead of 1, we can do 1.25 and you can see our scene will be more vibrant. For the shadows, saturation, shadows, we can change the saturation of the shadows here. So we can do 1.5 or below. As you can see there. Just by playing around with the slider, we can change the saturation however we want it to be. So I would say 1.2 or 1.1 is enough. Next, we can add a lens distortion. So we can have that camera effect in the edges of our scene. Let's click fit and let's increase the dispersion to 0.015. Let's add an anti-aliasing. Let's lower down the threshold and the contrast limit all the way up to 1 and the corner rounding. We can get a filter to smoothen out our scene. And then lastly, let's move these 5 nodes apart and let's add a texture. Let's add a mix color node and let's turn this into overlay. Connect the image to the first image and connect the color to the second socket. Then connect the image to the image here. What we can do here next is let's go to the texture tab and click new. Change the type from image or movie into clouds and turn the color from grayscale to color. So whatever the name of the texture here, use it. Then let's set the factor to somewhere like 0.1 to 0.3. Just barely noticeable. And then lastly, let's add an ellipse mask. Let's get a blur node. Let's do 300 by 300. And then mess with the width and also mess with the height as well. You can give this a higher number, like 500. We can duplicate this overlay and turn this into multiply and then just connect them all together. If you look at our final render and mess with the factor of this multiply, we have this effect here that darkens the edges of our renders. Now as you can see, we went from this into this with all of these nodes in the compositor area. Of course, you can always change the saturation if we don't want this to be saturated. So instead of 1.25, we can do 1.1 and lower down the saturation. Or what you can also do is you can add a hue saturation value if you want to change the saturation or the hue of the whole entire image. Lastly, I want to do one effect which will make our scene look better. Let's go to layout and let's add a plane and make sure the plane faces the camera. You can do this with the constraint, but I will just do it manually. Once you add that in, click the viewport shading and turn this into rendered. Let's go to the materials tab and click new. And then change the blend mode into alpha blend and the shadow into none. Then next, let's get a noise texture. Delete this BSDF. Click Ctrl T. Add the separate XYZ. Use the Y axis. And by changing the Z axis here into rotation, you can change the rotation of the noise texture. I will do -31. You can use a color ramp here. And then we can change the values here and color this however we want. Let's turn this from 3D into 4D. And let's add a driver here and tag frame divided by 1000. We can change the scale here. And we can also change the color ramp here. Lastly, let's add a gradient texture. And let's hold Ctrl T and the color ramp. Then let's mix this together by adding a mix color and turning this into multiply. And connecting the color ramp to the socket B. Set the factor up to 1. Now let's see here and change the color ramp accordingly. We can do ease. What we can do here next is we can add an emission shader, a transparent PSTF, and a mix shader. Connect the result to the factor and connect the result to the emission. Make sure the transparent BSTF is first and the emission goes second. Then see how this looks like. Then let's increase the emission strength here. And then we can mess with the gradient as well. If you want the effect to be slower, we can give this a higher number. Instead of 1000, we can do 2000. As you can see, it is slower. We can set the emission down. Just like so. And then here is the full effect. We can drag this down if you want more effects. Or we can also mess with the scale here. Once you're done, be sure to save your project and then click F12 or click the render tab, render image to see the final render. Once you're done, let's go back to the compositing tab. Then you can always change the value of this. So we can go from 1 to 1.2 just to slightly increase the brightness. There you go. So we went from this into this with just all of these nodes here, and then basically you're done with the entire anime style waterfall scene. So if you made it this far, congratulations, because you've created this anime style waterfall scene. And basically with just using these nodes, manipulating each passes using the blur node and the color ramp by changing the color, and using these three nodes to manipulate the saturation and the contrast. As you can see, we are able to achieve this anime style waterfall scene within Blender. And of course, if you render animation, all of the things here you did in the compositor will also work. So you don't have to render it frame by frame. And that's basically it on the bonus part of the anime style waterfall, which is only optional. It's not really required. Anyway, That's it, and I will see you guys soon.